Iran didn't lose a war. It walked into a trap. And the terrifying part? It still doesn't know how to get out. No American boots touched Iranian soil. No missiles were launched. No air campaign was ordered. Washington didn't attack Iran. It did something colder, something more calculated, something that military historians may study for the next 100 years. It simply waited. And while it waited, Iran began tearing itself apart from the inside out. Not quietly, not slowly, but visibly, violently, and in ways that are accelerating by the hour. Soldiers are abandoning their posts in groups. Protests are erupting across dozens of cities at the same time. Two armed forces wearing the uniform of the same country are refusing to send ambulances to each other's wounded. A foreign minister conducting official peace talks was called stupid, by name, on his own government's state television. And the man who was supposed to authorize every major decision the Islamic Republic makes is reportedly unreachable. If you're following this crisis and you want analysis that goes deeper than headlines, subscribe now, because what we're about to break down is one of the most sophisticated strategic operations in modern history, and it is moving fast. This is not a government under pressure. This is a government that has fractured into three competing survival plans, none of which can succeed without destroying the others, and all of which are running out of time simultaneously. To understand how a country reaches this point, you have to understand the architecture of what was built against it. Because what the United States constructed at the Strait of Hormuz is not a conventional naval blockade. It is a three-dimensional trap. And the most devastating layer isn't the one with the warships. The first layer is military. American carrier strike groups, destroyers, submarines, surveillance drones, and maritime patrol aircraft have turned the Strait into a zone of total naval dominance that Iran's remaining forces cannot meaningfully challenge. The second layer is economic. Before the blockade, Iran was exporting 1,850,000 barrels of oil per day, generating roughly $150 million in daily revenue. That number is now zero. Storage tanks are filling toward capacity. The geological clock on well shutdowns is running. Every hour the blockade holds, the damage compounds. But the third layer, the one that makes this historically unique, doesn't attack from outside at all. It attacks from inside, and the regime has no doctrine to defend against it. Here is the mechanism. The United States kept the Strait open for everyone except Iran. Saudi oil moves, Emirati oil moves, Qatari oil moves, commercial shipping flows with American naval protection. The global economy is largely unaffected. The humanitarian argument Iran was counting on, that the world would pressure Washington to back down because the Strait is too important to close, collapsed the moment America simply opened it for everyone else. Iran's isolation became total, and the international sympathy it needed never came. And now, whatever Iran does next makes things worse. If it tries to close the Strait further, the U.S. opens it. If it mines the water, the U.S. clears the mines and tightens the port blockade. If it fires on tankers, Washington seizes Iranian-linked ships in international waters. If it negotiates, the hardliners call it treason. If it refuses to negotiate, the economic clock runs out before any diplomatic window can open. There is no move on this board that doesn't cost Iran something it cannot afford to lose. That is why Washington is not hurrying. The trap doesn't need to be tightened. It only needs to be maintained. What the trap has produced inside Iran is a fracture so complete that the country has effectively stopped functioning as a single unified state. Three power centers, three survival strategies, and none of them are willing to accept the others. The first is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, led by Commander Ahmad Vahidi, a man whose history includes command responsibility for bombings and assassinations across Lebanon and Buenos Aires, who carries an Interpol notice from Argentina, and who was appointed to lead the Revolutionary Guards under circumstances that tell you everything about where the hardline faction's priorities lie. Vahidi's position is absolute. The war continues. Escalation proceeds. Any negotiation is treason. But what makes Vahidi's posture more than just ideological extremism is that it is institutionally existential. The IRGC controls an estimated 30 to 40% of Iran's domestic economy. Construction companies, telecommunications networks, oil contracts, banking operations, ports, airports. It is an economic empire built over 45 years using revolutionary legitimacy as cover for commercial accumulation that would be impossible to justify without the doctrine of permanent external threat. In peacetime, uncomfortable questions surface. Why does a military organization run banks? Why does it control ports? Why does it hold telecom contracts? These questions have no comfortable answers without an enemy. Without a war, the IRGC's empire becomes a political liability overnight. This is why peace itself is an existential threat to the institution, not just a policy disagreement. and yet the IRGC is calling for escalation from a position of shattered credibility. Iranian naval forces attempted to challenge American presence in the Strait and were neutralized in under 20 minutes. The deterrence Iran spent decades building, the fast boat swarms, the coastal missiles, the mine-laying capacity, was tested against real American naval power and found catastrophically insufficient. Now the organization is demanding a war it has already demonstrated it cannot win, while its soldiers go without salaries because the revenue lines that funded everything have been severed. A military empire whose troops are not being paid is not an institution preparing for victory. It is an institution in the early stages of internal collapse, using the language of revolutionary resolve as a mask. The second power center is the diplomatic and presidential wing: President Pezeshkian, Foreign Minister Araghchi, Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf, and they are fighting for their political lives. On April 20th, Pezeshkian made a public statement that landed inside the regime like a controlled demolition. He described infrastructure damage at $270 billion, currency at its lowest point in history, industrial zones struck, port infrastructure degraded, no market stability, no external funding. Then he added the line that transformed a policy statement into something approaching a revolutionary act within a regime that has never publicly acknowledged the cost of its own decisions. The truth must be told to the people, otherwise trust in government will completely erode. For the hardliners, that wasn't a policy position, that was switching sides, because you cannot tell the truth about what this war has cost and simultaneously explain why it should continue. Ghalibaf went further in a meeting with advisors, exclusively reported by Iran International. The parliament speaker described senior IRGC-aligned figures as extreme militia-like actors who will destroy Iran. He said state television was being weaponized against negotiations. He expressed fear of being removed from power. He worried that Araghchi would be ousted next. The head of Iran's parliament, officially one of the most powerful figures in the Islamic Republic, is afraid of being toppled by the organization he is supposed to help govern. That is not a government experiencing internal tension. That is a government that has ceased to function as a unified decision-making entity. And on April 17th, Araghchi announced that Hormuz was open to all commercial vessels, an attempt to signal diplomatic flexibility ahead of talks in Islamabad. The IRGC opened fire on tankers the same day. State television called him stupid. A foreign minister publicly humiliated by his own military's media while conducting official peace diplomacy is not managing a crisis. He is surviving one. But the faction the regime fears most of all doesn't issue press releases. It doesn't hold command meetings or control missile batteries. It stands in fuel lines that stretch for blocks in a country that sits on the world's fourth largest oil reserves. It shuts shops that can't receive stock because supply chains have collapsed. It drives trucks that have stopped on the road because refined diesel is unavailable or unaffordable. It chants in the streets of Tehran, Isfahan, Shiraz, and dozens of other cities simultaneously, and the chants are no longer about reform. Iran's social contract, the unspoken arrangement that sustained 45 years of authoritarian governance, was never ideological. It was economic. Not democracy, but cheap gasoline. Not freedom, but bread on the table. Not dignity, but basic needs met in exchange for political silence. The blockade didn't bend that contract. It tore it apart completely. The protest geography has changed in ways that structurally defeat the IRGC's suppression model. In 2009, the uprising was concentrated in Tehran. In 2019, flashpoints were specific cities responding to a gasoline price shock. The IRGC's doctrine for suppression was built for concentrated urban unrest, mass deployment into problem areas, overwhelming force, then managed aftermath through arrests and controlled messaging. That model is breaking. Protests are erupting simultaneously across dozens of cities, including provincial towns that never appeared in previous unrest. The IRGC cannot suppress everywhere at once. While it crushes one city, another ignites. While it moves forces to one province, crowds form in the next. The organization is being asked to simultaneously fight a war it is losing, manage an internal political fracture consuming institutional energy, pay soldiers it cannot currently afford, and suppress an uprising more geographically distributed than anything it has faced since 1979. It cannot do all four. And the one it is choosing to prioritize, maintaining the war machine, is the one that is accelerating the other three. Then there is the military dimension that state television has not touched, and that represents perhaps the most structurally alarming development in this entire crisis. Iran has two armies. They have hated each other for 45 years. The Artesh is Iran's conventional military, inherited from the Shah era, filled through mandatory conscription with soldiers whose ideological commitment to the Islamic Republic ranges from limited to non-existent. The regime never trusted the Artesh. After 1979, it created the IRGC specifically because it couldn't rely on a conventional military it hadn't built from ideological foundations. For 4 decades, the Revolutionary Guards received the best weapons, the best salaries, the best hospitals, and privileged access to the commercial contracts that made senior IRGC officers wealthy in ways their Artesh counterparts could never approach. Artesh soldiers have been treated as second class within their own country's military structure, drafted into service for a revolution they didn't choose, and compensated accordingly. That resentment has now reached a breaking point under conditions that expose it with maximum brutality. Frontline Artesh units suffering significant casualties under bombardment requested medical evacuation and hospital access from IRGC forces operating in the same theater. The IRGC refused. Citing ambulance shortages and blood supply constraints, Revolutionary Guard personnel declined to transport wounded Artesh soldiers to IRGC medical facilities. Soldiers are suffering from treatable wounds while the organization sharing their battlefield cites logistics. That is not military stress. That is 2 armed forces that have become enemies while wearing the uniforms of the same country. The material situation confirms the depth of the collapse. Some frontline units are being issued 20 rounds of ammunition for every 2 soldiers. 20 rounds total. An automatic weapon fires 10 rounds per second. The combined firepower of 2 soldiers lasts 2 seconds of sustained fire. Units report operations without reliable access to drinking water or adequate food. Meanwhile, the IRGC's missile units, the regime's best resourced and most ideologically reliable forces, are experiencing communication equipment failures and basic supply shortages. The commander's revealed priority? Technical components for missile systems are delivered. Food for the troops is not. The result is mass desertion. Not individuals, but groups, formations, soldiers abandoning bases in numbers large enough to constitute a military phenomenon. Reserve mobilization was ordered. Most reservists did not report. Some used the order as a signal to take their families toward border crossings. When a mobilization order accelerates civilian migration, the state's authority has reached a threshold that historically does not recover. And the protests know it. Chants of "the army is with the people" are rising in multiple cities, a direct invitation from civilian crowds to Artesh commanders to make a choice. The diplomatic wing understands what that means and is quietly exploring whether Artesh leadership can be aligned with the presidential faction. Not a traditional coup, but a convergence of institutional interests capable of shifting power away from Vahidi and the IRGC. The IRGC reads any such movement as exactly what it would be. And when the IRGC identifies a coup attempt, its response is absolute. That is the most dangerous moment, not when Iran agrees to negotiate, but when Vahidi decides the internal threat is more urgent than the external one and turns the organization inward against its own country's military. Outside Iran's borders, the isolation has reached a point unimaginable 3 months ago. China, which purchased 90% of Iran's oil exports and signed a 25-year strategic partnership promising hundreds of billions in investment, has gone quiet. Xi Jinping's recent call went to Riyadh, not Tehran. Chinese ships are being fired on by the same IRGC forces Beijing's partnership was supposed to align with. China is calculating whether Iran's further weakening now serves Chinese strategic interests better than stabilization. Russia's position is equally cold beneath the surface of solidarity. Lavrov condemned the blockade at Antalya, then in the same breath stated that Russia is ready to supply energy to countries affected by the disruption. Russia is advertising its readiness to replace Iranian oil while performing solidarity with the country whose market share it is quietly capturing. Every barrel Iran cannot export is a barrel Moscow can sell. The proxy network is evaporating, Hezbollah degraded, Hamas crushed, the Houthis calculating whether continued escalation saves Tehran or accelerates strikes on their own positions. Iraqi militias retreating. Every one of these organizations watched the IRGC fail in its own strait in 20 minutes and drew the same conclusion. If Tehran cannot protect its own waters, it cannot guarantee anyone else's survival. The logic of fighting for Iran collapses. The 40-year proxy architecture was sustained by the perception that the center could hold. That perception is now broken, and it cannot be rebuilt under these conditions. Iran has 10 to 14 days before oil storage reaches capacity and well shutdowns become unavoidable. Some of those wells, once shut down under these conditions, will not fully recover. The blockade is not just stopping revenue, it is permanently degrading the physical asset base of the Iranian energy sector. Meanwhile, fuel lines form at gas stations across an oil-producing nation because the refined fuel that bridges domestic production gaps can no longer get through. Pezeshkian says negotiate urgently. The IRGC blocks every channel. The supreme leader reportedly cannot provide authorization. 4 men from the revolutionary generation of 1988 are making existential decisions for a nuclear-capable state under maximum pressure, with zero financial runway, internal military fracture, and a popular uprising that has stopped asking for reform and started demanding the regime's end. The United States has not attacked Iran. It engineered the conditions under which Iran attacks itself, made the IRGC's war doctrine financially unsustainable, while that very doctrine destroys the only diplomatic options that could relieve the pressure, made every faction's survival strategy contingent on defeating the others before time runs out, and then ensured there isn't enough time. Not a war, a trap, built with warships and sanctions and patience. But Washington is watching one variable above all others. A cornered regime does not always act rationally. Sometimes it chooses maximum chaos, because in chaos, the IRGC retains the suppression capacity that gives it relevance. The civilian population is too frightened to organize, and the diplomatic faction cannot function. Vahidi's calculation may not be save Iran. It may be survive the collapse by controlling the collapse. And that calculation, made by a man with his history, commanding an organization with its institutional structure, inside a state with nuclear capabilities, is what is keeping American analysts fixed on every signal from Tehran, with the particular intensity reserved for only the most dangerous possible scenarios. The streets are burning, the soldiers are deserting, the diplomats are afraid, the generals are firing on tankers while the foreign minister announces peace, the wells are filling, the allies are gone, and the man who is supposed to make the final decision reportedly cannot speak. The clock is running, Washington is waiting, and Iran is running out of time to decide whether the regime survives by making a deal or collapses trying to avoid one. If this breakdown gave you clarity that no headline did, subscribe. We go this deep every single day, and this story is not close to finished.